Eagle and Child podcast. This is our first ever episode. I'm so excited. Our preview podcast with our very special guest, Mr. John Adams. John, thank you so much for joining us on our first ever Eagle and Child podcast episode.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's great to see you, my friend. So, for those of you who don't know John, let me introduce him to you. He is a Bible teacher in Haiti. He has got a degree in history. He's got a master's in biblical studies. Right now, he's just writing up his thesis on the Azusa Street revival. I've read it. It's brilliant. He's also on faculty at Theos University as their resident historian, teaching all things history. It's been one of my favorite classes that I've watched at Theos U has been some of John's history lectures and classes. And right now he's writing a new course on C.S. Lewis, which is just incredible. I've got some of the lectures that I've been able to preview them, and they are just brilliant. Chris Palmer is doing the C.S. Lewis lecture, the C.S. Lewis podcast for us, but I think we should have got you, John. Chris Palmer's hogged it, but everybody wanted it.
I'm sure he'll do a great job.
Yeah, no, he'll do a great job. And if he does a rubbish job, we'll get you to do it the week after. You can fix it.
If I get that email, I know what happened.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, sorry, Chris, you got bumped. But it is so good to have you with us, John. Thank you so much for coming on. Today, we're going to do a bit of a Eagle and Child podcast on steroids. So we're going to look at 4 different historical figures, but just for the people watching along at home, the 4 people and the one lady and her cat in Siberia who have tuned into our podcast today, I just want to explain a little bit about what the podcast is. Because when I say, it's the Eagle and Child podcast, people are like, okay, Eagle and Child, like, why did you name your podcast the Eagle and Child? They're like, she's definitely lost it. But people who get the reference, they know what we're talking about. So they're like, oh, that's awesome. But most people are like, Eagle and Child, okay. So you already know this, John, but the Eagle and Child was a place in Oxford, England, where J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis would go to meet together on a Tuesday morning. Every Tuesday morning they'd meet together, they'd discuss their literary ideas, and they became some really famous, influential Christian thinkers in Christian history. They set up this group called the Inklings, and so the Eagle and Child podcast is really to gather all these different guests and people from around the world who are interested in that sort of stuff and discuss famous people and influential Christian figures in Christian history who have really helped to shape Christianity as we know it today. Their inspiring stories, their thoughts, their theology, and just help us to get to know where we came from. What's your famous quote from Bob Marley about church history, John?
If you don't know your history, you don't know where you're coming from.
Exactly. I wholeheartedly agree. So that's what we're up to. That's what we're doing today. And we are going to do a rapid fire episode through 4 historical figures with Mr. John Adams. So are you ready to go, John?
Absolutely.
You're ready to go. Okay, the first one we're going to look at is Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine. So can you tell us a little bit about who he was, his background, some of his thoughts? Go for it.
Definitely. Yeah, so I actually say Augustine. I heard a seminary professor say once that St. Augustine is in Florida and St. Augustine is in heaven. So
yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Well, he could say that. He could say that, but he would be wrong.
Okay.
No, I'm joking. I'm an Aussie, so I don't pronounce anything correctly. Nothing.
Yeah. So Augustine was born in the 5th century or 4th century, 300s, a little bit after Constantine made the Roman Empire Christian. And he, as a young man, he was kind of privileged, got a good education. His father was a pagan, his mother was a Christian. And he kind of, his mother was praying for him hard the entire time he was a youth, but he really wasn't interested in faith at all as a youth. He was, into all kinds of sin. and he got sent to the big city for his education, which he said was a frying pan of temptations. And he graduated. He was very smart. He graduated and ended up becoming a professor of rhetoric. He was a very good speaker, debater. Ended up moving to Italy, which was kind of the center of the Roman Empire, where the best jobs were. And spent a little time in Rome, and then went up north to Milan, where he really began to make his career. And during all that time, he was really not interested in Christianity. He thought it was kind of a religion for simple people. And he was more interested in the pagan philosophies that he thought were intellectually hefty. And when he got to Milan, he met a bishop named Ambrose, who was kind of the first Christian he'd ever heard who could preach on his level. And he was very impressed, and he kept coming back and sitting in on the services, even though he wasn't a Christian. And eventually converted. Eventually he became convinced on an intellectual level by Ambrose that Christianity was true, but his flesh wasn't in accord with his mind. Like, he was very attached to his concubine. He was very attached.
Yeah, he was a ladies' man.
He was definitely
Augustine's a ladies' man, 100%.
Latin lover. Yeah. So his mind was there, but his body wasn't. And there's a famous scene in his book, The Confessions, where he's kind of had this long, discussion with his friend, and he's just really frustrated because he can't muster up the will to really commit to a Christian life. Walks out into the garden in frustration, and he hears this child next door singing, "Take and read, take and read." And he takes it as a sign that he's supposed to open the Bible and read the Bible. And so it falls open to a passage in Romans that basically says, put off the desires of the flesh, put on the Lord Jesus Christ. And he said, reading that passage, somehow he got a gift of grace or something in that moment that enabled him to make that decision. And so from that point forward, he lived as a Christian. His mother eventually came and lived with him in Italy, which was kind of a big deal because he'd actually lied to his mother before he left Africa. He told her that basically he promised her that, no, I'm not moving, I'm not going anywhere. And the next day he took off and got on a ship and left, so their reunion must have been a little bit awkward, but she was happy.
The ultimate trickster. Yeah, she was probably just so happy that he's saved. She's like, woohoo! Yeah. Been praying forever.
Yeah. Yeah. So she came to Italy. She died shortly afterward, and he ended up moving back to Africa. And eventually, he had no intention of going into the ministry. He was really interested in a monastic lifestyle. He just wanted to kind of read books, meditate, and be spiritual. But there was such a need for gifted ministers and such a shortage of them in his area that one Sunday when he was at church, the bishop was preaching on how badly they needed young, gifted people to be pastors, and the congregation turns and kind of looks at Augustine.
All eyes on him.
Yeah, and they're like, "Wait a
That's
minute,
not
you're really smart."
Yeah.
And
he's like, "Do. I need to go to the bathroom."
Back in town. So they pushed him to the front and kind of forced him to, and he started crying, and the congregation were trying to comfort him. They're thinking he's crying because he doesn't want to be a priest. He wants to be a bishop because he's a very well-educated man. He wouldn't want to just be a priest. Yeah. And he's actually crying because he's losing his freedom. He doesn't want to be in the ministry.
Oh, absolutely.
Kind of got drafted into God's army.
I love him. I think he's awesome. And I love the way that, he obviously was a ladies' man, but seeing his conversion story, you see how just his love for Jesus just totally supersedes and engulfs him. And he's just immersed in this love of God that's so much greater than any love that he's experienced on earth. I love that about him.
Yeah, my friend Josh Bidell loves Augustine, and he says that if you ever want to deepen your prayer life, reading Augustine is great. But from my perspective, it's if you ever want to feel like your prayers don't measure up.
You're rubbish. You're not even a real Christian. But yeah, so tell us a little bit about what were some of his ideas? How did he sort of change the game theologically? What did he contribute? who were the heretics that he sort of refuted? What did he do?
So after he kind of got forced to be a priest, he did eventually work his way up to bishop, and he kind of spent most of his life in controversy. He would get out of one controversy and get dragged into another. So he faced, several major controversies. One was with the Pelagians. Pelagius was a British monk who basically believed that God's grace is something extra. Like, we don't need God's grace. If God commands something, it's because you can do it. And so you just need to buckle down and
try harder.
Try harder. Yeah.
You idiot.
Exactly. Yeah. And so Augustine completely disagreed with that and ended up writing several works against the Pelagians. But Augustine argued for a strong theology of God's grace. He said, like, we're not even able to love God. God has to first give us grace and change our affections. And Augustine was pretty influenced by his personal testimony. Like, it took Augustine a long time to actually get to that point where he was able to commit his will to doing God's will. And so Augustine pushed hard for a theology of grace.
That it was by the grace of God that his life was changed and transformed. So, yeah,
absolutely
makes sense.
Yeah, his theology was eventually recognized by a church council as orthodox, and Pelagius was kind of rode off into the sunset.
Yeah, get over there on that island.
Yeah.
Don't come back.
Yeah, you're canceled.
Yeah.
Another controversy he got into was with the Donatists. The Donatists were, so Augustine was living one generation after Constantine made Christianity legal, and the Donatists were a group that basically said that ministers who had yielded under pressure when persecution had still been in effect and had kind of given up the gospel, whatever they did as ministers was invalid. So if they baptized you, your baptism doesn't count. If they eat communion, it's not real. So Augustine disagreed with that too. He said, like, if we were constantly worrying about whether the person who baptized us was actually a Christian, and our baptism depended on them being real, we would never have any security as believers ourselves.
Absolutely.
Sacrament, God's grace flows through the sacrament independently of the worthiness of the minister conferring it, which also has become, kind of an important point.
Standard. Yeah,
definitely. So, Augustine fought the Donatists. He eventually did defeat the Donatists. It wasn't as clean of a victory as the victory of the Pelagians, because the Donatism was really tied up. It wasn't just about the theological aspects. It also had a kind of a political aspect. A lot of the Donatists hated the priests who had sold out to Rome because they hated Rome, and they were African nationalists who didn't
hate Rome.
So they were anti-Roman in general, and so there was a kind of a political aspect. There were actually Donatist terrorists who attacked, Catholic churches at the time.
Crazy, hey?
Yeah.
Church history just shows how tame we are today.
It does.
No one's being burnt at the stake. No one's like terrorizing Catholic churches. Oh, well, other faiths are, but Christians aren't.
Yeah. I mean, Augustine had to deal with a lot of things pastors today probably are thankful they don't. I mean, there are transcripts of Augustine's sermons where Augustine has to plead with the people to stop talking while he's preaching.
Well, some of us do have to deal with that. Anyone in youth ministry can relate.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I forgot about youth ministry.
Or kids ministry.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Okay, so can you tell us some of his famous quotes? Like, what are some great quotes that Augustine threw out there that we should know if we just want to sort of dabble in knowing a little bit about him?
Sure, yes. So Augustine's most famous quote is probably from the Confessions. The first line says, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." That's been quoted many, many times.
Such a good quote.
One of the funnier quotes is from one of his works against the Donatists. The Donatists were kind of schismatics. They thought they were the only true believers. And so Augustine wrote, "The clouds roll with thunder, that the house of the Lord shall be built throughout the earth, and these frogs sit in their marsh and croak, we are the only Christians."
These frogs savage.
Yeah.
Frogs.
Yeah.
It's like the ultimate insult, you frog, of that time period. Awesome. And can you give us just a random fact about Augustine? Or a couple of random facts.
Towards the end of Augustine's life, he actually died with the Vandals who were overrunning the Roman Empire at the gates of his city. And he had actually written a long book called The City of God to try to explain that the church doesn't really need the Roman Empire to survive. The church will exist independently of any city of man.
Wow.
Another interesting fact about him is that he was an early abolitionist.
That is very interesting. Tell us more about that, because I think people would be interested in that.
Yeah, Augustine was opposed to slavery in his own day. He actually forced several priests who were under his command to liberate their slaves. His argument was pretty straightforward. He didn't think in Genesis that God had given man dominion over rational creatures, only over irrational creation. Yeah. And so if it's a rational creature, you don't have dominion over it, and so you have to let that person go free.
Incredible. All right, do you want to say anything more about Augustine, or shall we move on?
No, I think I said everything. You covered it.
You well and truly covered it. All right, awesome. So very good. Thank you so much, John. You just pour forth gold. I loved it. Can we move on to our second rapid fire podcast preview person that we're looking at, Blaise Pascal?
Yes.
Blaise Pascal. Tell us about him, the scientist theologian.
Yes. Pascal is interesting because he didn't live very long. He only lived 39 years, but he got an incredible amount of stuff done in 39 years. Puts probably most people to shame. Pascal was a scientist. He was a mathematician. He was a philosopher, and he was also an apologist for the last 8 years of his life. He is said to have invented the first computer. His father was a tax collector in France.
He invented a lot of things, didn't he?
He invented a lot of things.
A number of things. What else did he invent?
So he invented the calculating device to kind of help his father with his work. He wrote several influential scientific papers. He invented the syringe. He invented the wristwatch. He invented the hydraulic lift.
Yeah, amazing.
He was kind of embarrassed by his own talents. Like, he was so gifted. But he lived at a time of history when people were kind of beginning to think that science was a more reliable guide to ultimate truth than divine revelation. And Pascal kind of had a unique vantage point on that argument because he was so well versed in science that he could see that was a dead end. Science can tell us how things work, but it can't really give us a why to the universe.
Absolutely. I love that.
Yeah. So Pascal was also a person who was deeply acquainted with suffering. His life, he was a very sickly person for his entire life. It's probably why he died so early. He also lost his mother at the age of 3. Yeah. He had a lot of other things go wrong. But when he was a young man, his father had a real bad fall on the ice and dislocated his hip. And he had to take him to the doctor. And the doctor turned out to be a Jansenist. And Jansenism was a movement in the Catholic Church at that time that basically was Augustinian in its theology and stressed God's grace. And this doctor told Pascal that he believed that suffering could actually be an avenue for grace to flow into our lives. Wow. And so Pascal was intrigued by that idea and followed the Lord for a while. But then after his father died, he was kind of overcome with grief and went back into his old life. He was very wealthy because he'd done a lot of great scientific work. And he used that wealth for a while to kind of buy himself every conceivable comfort, all the pleasure money could buy. But it really couldn't buy him happiness. And so he reached, at one point, he reached what he called a state of quiet despair. He didn't know what the meaning of life was. Yeah. But when he was 31, he had this intense spiritual experience. He had a vision of the crucifixion, and he wrote most of it down on paper today people call it his night of fire, because at the very top of the page he writes the word fire in
Yeah.
big letters, all caps. And he also wrote, that God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not the God of philosophers and scholars, certitude,
Mm.
joy, peace, many other kind of these fragments. It's like these things are kind of popping into his spirit, and he's writing down as he sees them. And that experience made him a Christian permanently, and he would be a faithful Christian for the rest of his life.
Absolutely incredible. I love him. I love reading through Pascal quotes because I love that dichotomy between faith and science, and that he was a brilliant scientist,
Yeah.
but yet he found that science comes to an end, and that's where faith begins, and that's where you have this incredible relationship with God, not only through reason but through the heart. So can you give us some of his famous quotes? I think you'll share some down those sorts of lines.
Absolutely, yeah. So one of his famous quotes is that the heart has its reasons, which reason does not know at all. So
Haha, beautiful.
what
I love that.
he meant by the heart is that kind of an intuition. He didn't just mean like feelings or sentiment. He saw the heart as an intuition. But basically, what he meant by that is that if people want to believe something, they'll find reasons to support their belief. And so he also said there's light enough for anyone who wants to see, and there's darkness enough for anyone who doesn't. So there's enough clarity to kind of illuminate those who are chosen, and enough darkness to keep them humble. It doesn't mean that God is unknowable or that belief would be unreasonable. It just means that ultimately reason kind of carries us only so far. And at that point, we have to make a decision that's not really like it can have a reason as a foundation, but ultimately it's a decision that's more of a decision of the will to either follow the Lord or not follow the Lord.
So good, so good. Do you have any other quotes from Pascal?
Yeah, so he's got some great quotes. One of the things he says is that reason's last step is the recognition that there are an infinite number of things which are beyond it. He says, don't be surprised at the sight of simple people who believe without argument. God makes them love him and hate themselves. He inclines their hearts to believe. We shall never believe with a vigorous and unquestioning faith unless God touches our hearts, and we shall believe as soon as he does so.
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Okay, well, is that all you want to say? Oh no, and maybe a random fact about Blaise Pascal.
Yeah, so
we want to get into the deep, dark, dirty secrets of these historical figures. So what's a random fact?
In God's providence, we probably never would have known about his night of fire unless one of his servants, after he died, saw a bulge in the lining of his coat and tore it open and discovered the sheet in there, that he had written fire at the top in big letters.
Amazing.
That's the only reason we know about his conversion experience.
I love that. It's so powerful, isn't it? Very cool, very cool. Do you want to say anything more about Blaise Pascal?
No, well, he wrote his big work of apologetics. He spent the rest of his life as a Christian trying to convince people that Christianity was reasonable. And his book is called Pensées, which means thoughts in French. He never
You can
finished.
speak French, can't you?
I can. Yeah.
We should do the rest of this interview in French.
Yeah.
I won't understand it, but the people will enjoy it more.
That'll give you interpretation of tongues to be able to.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I do believe in that, so.
Yeah, so he never finished the book, but after he died, somebody put the pieces that he did have into publishable form. And Peter Kraft, whom I think you're familiar with.
I love Kraft, yeah.
He actually calls that one of the best, maybe the best work of apologetics for modern people.
Amazing.
So even Pascal's unfinished thoughts are better than most of ours.
Our finished, conclusive thoughts. That's awesome. What a legend. What a hero. Awesome. Okay, are you ready to move on to our next historical figure? Coming down the conveyor belt of history, we have Mr. C.S. Lewis. Yeah?
So C.S. Lewis, he's definitely one of my favorite characters in church history.
Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, so Lewis was born in Northern Ireland in 1898. He was a very bookish little boy. He spent a lot of time indoors reading. And when he was 9 years old, he had a very happy childhood, but when he was 9 years old, his whole life kind of fell apart.
Yeah,
And
right.
his mother died of cancer. And his father really didn't really seem to know how to process that. And he
Yeah.
sent Lewis off to England to boarding school uh,
Mm.
like 2 weeks after his mother died. And
Crazy. It's insane
Lewis,
what people used to do.
it is, yeah. But he sent Lewis to boarding school, probably to the worst possible boarding school in England.
Mm.
Had an abusive headmaster. He had later was certified as insane. Lewis himself wasn't physically abused, but he regularly witnessed other children who were.
Mm.
And that those experiences kind of cemented a deep pessimism in him. He ended up becoming an
Yeah.
atheist, which was deepened even further. He got sent off to World War One. He saw terrible things there.
Mm.
So by the time he
That's
came back and went to Oxford University, he was kind of a hardened atheist.
crazy.
Yeah.
And just to lighten it up for just a moment, what was his nickname? Jackie?
Yeah. So he actually chose his own nickname. He walked into his father's study one day and told him that I'm not Clive Staples anymore. I'm Jack.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Jaxie.
Jaxie. What a random nickname to call yourself when your
Yeah.
name is Clive Staples. Jaxie.
He,
Jaxie.
he was apparently kind of a strange child. I mean, he on another occasion he walked into his dad's study and he said, "Father, I have a prejudice against the French." His father was like, "Why on earth do you have a prejudice against the French?" He's like, "If I knew why, it wouldn't be a prejudice, now would it?"
And it's like, how does this kid even know what prejudice means?
Right. Yeah. I mean, he's like
Insane.
7 years old.
Yeah. That's crazy. All right, sorry to interrupt you. Yeah, what else do you want to say about C.S. Lewis? So I think you're up to, he's just about to go to Oxford.
Yeah. So he came back and he went to Oxford and then eventually became a professor at Oxford
Mm.
of first philosophy and then literature. And he started meeting other faculty members who were every bit as intelligent as he was, but who were not atheists, who were
Mm.
some of them Christians, some of them just kind of believed in God in a general
Amazing.
way. And he was kind of shaken by that, like, and he started re-examining the foundations of what he believed, and eventually became a Christian largely under the influence of J.R.R. Tolkien. Uh,
Amazing.
Tolkien. Tolkien kind of helped him resolve uh, the question of all the other religions and Christianity. So Tolkien kind of gave him the idea that these other myths that he loved and which he had felt, some kind of longing coming through, were actually kind of signposts. They pointed forward to
Mm.
God would actually do it in history.
Yeah.
So there's myths about dying and rising gods in ancient history, and Tolkien kind of gave him the idea that these might be good dreams, so to speak, that God gave to the
Amazing.
pagans. And so he was able to put his faith in Christ, and uh, that wasn't necessarily the most popular thing to do at Oxford University. And so, um,
Absolutely.
but he eventually became a writer of apologetics. He said, I've had this experience and I want others to know about it as well. And he wrote a number of books defending Christianity. And then at the end
Amazing.
of his life, he kind of moved from, kind of more philosophical defenses of Christianity to trying to uh, actually encode Christianity in narrative and myth, which he
Mm.
believed was much more effective because Lewis had this idea that before the reason will change, the imagination has to be kind of lit up. You're not going to change
Yeah.
somebody's mind unless you can kind of
Awakened and engaged.
their head. Yeah.
I love
And
that thought.
yeah.
And it's a great thought. It's a great encouragement, I think, to all the creatives and all the writers and all the different people in that sort of field, musicians, different things like that. When you can engage people's imagination and their creativity, it's actually a gateway to engaging their reason and their understanding and their openness to accepting your ideas. I think that's really cool.
Absolutely. Yeah. So art plays a powerful
Mm,
role in our lives.
totally.
Uh, Yeah, later in his life, Lewis met an American woman named Joy Gresham, who she's a really interesting person herself. She was like a former communist,
Crazy.
had a really abusive husband, came to England with her two
Rogue
sons,
woman.
kind of on a whim. Like she was a fan of Lewis's writing, and she moved to England more or less with the objective of meeting him and
She was
romancing.
she was definitely in love with Lewis.
Yeah,
She is out to marry this guy.
and she did
And
it.
she won. Yeah, exactly. To all of the
Yeah.
girls out there who want to make the first move, look at Joy Gresham. Is that her last name? Gresham or Gersham? Gresham.
Yeah, so originally she was Joy Davidman. She was Jewish.
Yeah.
So Gresham was her married name, and she ended up divorcing that guy, and later married Lewis. You know, they kind of married. It was a weird marriage because she was about to get kicked out of England. She didn't have the right to stay, and so she comes to Lewis with this sob story and basically convinces him that, well, if you'll marry me, then I can stay in England. And I think I don't know if Lewis was like, I think he convinced himself that this was just a purely, practical arrangement. But on her end, it was definitely not a practical arrangement.
Absolutely not.
And then,
Do you think that's why Tolkien was a bit sour on him? He's like, you idiot. Number one, you're marrying a divorcee. Sorry?
Yeah, a lot of people didn't like his marriage. They thought she was a gold digger. They didn't like that she was American.
Absolutely.
But she got cancer not long after they married, and then
that's sad.
That moved Lewis even more than probably he already had been moved to take her as for real as his wife, and he cared for her. And then when she died, it was a very traumatic experience for Lewis because it was kind of like living his mother's death all over again.
Yeah, so crazy.
The worst spot in his entire life, and God walked him through it again. But this time he was much more mature, and he was able to kind of give his wife back to the Lord eventually, and not repeat the mistake of his earlier days and become an atheist.
Yeah, exactly. Thank God he didn't.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we wouldn't have the Chronicles of Narnia or Mere Christianity.
Yeah. One fun fact about Lewis is he wrote his autobiography in 1955. It's called Surprised by Joy. And the word joy for him means a longing that can't be satisfied by anything in this world. It's a longing that's sweeter than any satisfaction of that longing.
Beautiful.
He saw it as a pointer to God, but that was actually before he met his wife, who also was named Joy. So
he was very surprised by that Joy too. She was a surprising woman.
Yeah.
No, that's awesome. Do you have any great quotes from Lewis? I know a lot of people have quoted Lewis, so many people will know them. But
so he's got so many great quotes. Probably the one I like the most, this one's a little long, but he says, imagine yourself as a living house. God comes in to rebuild that house. And at first, perhaps you can understand what he's doing. He's getting the drains right and stopping the leaks in the roof and so on. You knew that those jobs needed doing, so you're not surprised. But presently, he starts knocking the house about in a way that hurts abominably and doesn't seem to make any sense. What on earth is he up to? The explanation is that he is building quite a different house from the one you thought of, throwing out a new wing here, putting on an extra floor there, running up towers, making courtyards. You thought you were being made into a decent little cottage, but he is building a palace. He intends to live in it himself.
He intends to live in it himself. I love that so much. That's beautiful. Do you have any other quotes from Lewis that you want to share?
Sure. Yeah. So one of his most famous quotes is, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. For him, Christianity provided a narrative that tied the world together, tied everything in life together. So
beautiful. All right, awesome. And do you have some random facts about Lewis? Random facts. These are
random facts. The first random fact is that he was really, really bad at math.
The worst.
I can empathize with.
So can I actually.
To graduate high school.
But so bad he couldn't even make small change at shops, right?
Right. Yeah. He
That bad.
He was that bad. Uh, so he was lucky even to get into Oxford, because Oxford actually had
Yeah.
a general education exam that you had to pass, and math was obviously a part of that. The only reason he was able to get into Oxford was that when he returned from war, there was temporarily a law that exempted returning servicemen from that requirement, and so
Crazy.
not for that we might never have heard of C.S. Lewis.
Amazing, isn't it? Or maybe
Yeah.
even Tolkien, because it was their friendship that brought Tolkien's writing to life, wasn't it?
That's right. Yeah, Tolkien probably wouldn't have finished The Lord of the Rings if not for Lewis. It's another fun fact.
Crazy. So, yeah, so that's amazing. So that just shows you the hand of God in all of it as well, like bringing this about. I think that's so cool. So, yeah, they're your fun facts about Lewis. Do you want to share anything else?
I guess maybe one last thing is that his death was completely overshadowed, like even for most people in his immediate area, because he died on the exact same day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated.
Crazy.
And so he died, and like really nobody noticed.
Oh.
But in retrospect, he's probably had a lot more influence on history than Kennedy.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Definitely on us.
Absolutely.
I love C.S. Lewis. Okay, awesome. So that's all we have from C.S. Lewis. We're going to move on to our final historical figure coming down the conveyor belt of the Eagle and Child podcast, J.R.R. Tolkien, who is the second founder of the Inklings, who met with Lewis at the Eagle and Child. So what can you tell us about his background, his development, his ideas, different things like that? Who was he?
Yeah, so Tolkien was an orphan as a child. He was born in South Africa, but by the age of 12, he moved back to England, and both of his parents had died. He was actually entrusted to the care of a Catholic priest. He met his future wife, Edith, in the orphanage, but they lost touch. Tolkien went to Oxford. He was a very gifted, student. And while at Oxford, Tolkien actually wrote to Edith to catch up and found out that she was engaged. And he actually went to her in person and convinced her to break up with her fiance and marry him instead.
Scandalous. Very scandalous.
Yeah, he apparently had some self-confidence.
Yeah.
The following year, he got sent off to war. So he might have, that marriage might not have made it. He actually fought in the Battle of the Somme, which was one of the bloodiest battles in history. 1 million people were killed or wounded. By the end of the war, like basically all of his friends were dead. He probably only survived because he got trench fever and got sent home to recover. So he had, kind of a troubled early part of his life. But after the war, he had a quirky life his entire life. After the war, he got a job working for the dictionary, which I didn't even know that was a job. That he could get.
And wasn't he world expert on something starting with the letter W? It sounds like Sesame Street. It's like
he's the world's leading expert on words of Germanic origin that begin with the letter W. I don't even know how many words.
What a legacy!
Yeah.
Well, I can only hope to one day be known for such things.
Yeah. So obviously, a guy like that is going to become a university professor. He's probably not suited for himself.
Obviously.
He had a speech impediment. He was very difficult to understand, but his students loved him anyway. He was so brilliant that they would give him standing ovations, even though they could barely hear him a lot of the time. But maybe they were giving standing ovations because they were just glad that the lecture was over. I don't know.
Yeah, they're actually standing up to walk out.
Yeah.
They're incredibly rude, but he's taking it as standing ovations.
Yeah.
He was very self-confident, so who knows? Maybe that's his own interpretation.
Yeah, I always got the impression, I get the impression by reading about him that he didn't really care much about people's opinions one way or the other.
Totally. Well,
I don't know
if you can share a little bit about his relationship with Lewis, because he definitely was a very honest friend, a savage friend.
Well, early in their relationship, he had a very positive influence on Lewis. Like as we said, he
basically led him to salvation.
Yeah. And Lewis, but from that point forward, Lewis was kind of the fanboy in the relationship, and Tolkien was kind of like the cat who's, like who'll let you pet him, but he's not very interested in anything that you have to say. It's like I'll grace you with my presence, but nothing else.
Yeah. That's a great way to put it.
But I mean, I'm sure they had a better friendship than that. But he was a very slow writer. He was just notoriously perfectionistic, and he might never have published any of his stories if it wasn't for Lewis, who kept goading him in their Inklings meetings, encouraging him and pushing him to publish them. And so Tolkien finally took Lewis's advice about 8 years after they met. He published The Hobbit. He just kind of got the idea out of nowhere while he was grading student exams. And another interesting fact is that that book probably wouldn't have gotten published if the proofreader hadn't given the book to his son to kind of test out and see whether kids would like it. And the boy came back totally enraptured and wanted more Hobbit stories.
Aww.
So The Hobbit did really well, and then Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings in 3 volumes as a follow-up. And that was largely due to Lewis's encouragement. Lewis always believed in the book, even though some other Inklings didn't even think it was very good. Some of the other Inklings booed Tolkien when he read the book.
Well, it's interesting because then Tolkien hated the Chronicles of Narnia.
Right.
That's how savage he is. Lewis is the only one who likes his writing, but he hates Lewis's writing.
That's right. Yeah. So they had a very one-sided relationship in that regard.
Yeah.
Lewis loved everything Tolkien ever wrote, and Tolkien did not approve of most of Lewis's writing. He hated the Chronicles of Narnia because he was a purist. He hated that Lewis mixed different genres of fantasy in the same pot, and he didn't think it was very good. He couldn't stand it. So, yeah, they did have a one-sided relationship. He was also Roman Catholic. Lewis was Anglican, and so they had some theological differences between them. Tolkien didn't like Lewis's apologetics work. He thought that Lewis should leave the role of defending the faith to professional ministers. Lewis always said, well, I'd be glad to if there were any of them who would step up and do the job. Like, they don't really seem to be doing anything, so I'm standing the gap.
Someone's got to do it.
Someone's got to do it, yeah. But the real point of conflict between them was that Lewis ended up marrying Joy, who was a divorcee.
Yeah.
And Tolkien didn't believe in divorce. He was, very conservative Catholic. And so he basically stopped talking to Lewis after Lewis did that. They did reconcile at the end of their life. Yeah,
on one of their deathbeds, right? Tolkien's deathbed.
Well, Lewis died about 10 years before Tolkien, so it was Lewis's deathbed. And at one point, Lewis wrote a letter to Tolkien that just said, "I miss you very much." And, Tolkien came and spoke to Lewis before he died, and they reconciled. And when Lewis died, he said it felt like he was a tree being cut down by the roots. So he was very moved by losing his friend.
All right, what are some famous Tolkien quotes that you have for us, Mr. John Adams?
So Tolkien had this whole philosophy called subcreation. He thought that we basically are enabled by God to create worlds almost on the same level that God has created our world.
Crazy.
He said, "We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God. Indeed, only by myth-making, only by becoming a sub-creator and inventing stories, can man ascribe to the state of perfection that he knew before the fall." I'm not completely sure he's right about that, but it's a very interesting.
Yeah. It's interesting, but it's total rubbish. No, I'm joking. Garbage, yeah, total trash.
No, he might be right about it. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think the concept, maybe not in its fullest extent, I think I can relate to. That we can see like a fragment, a splinter, like in a mirror dimly lit, we can see that creative glory of God because we're made in his image. So I think to a much less extent than probably Tolkien knew, I would probably agree with him.
Yeah. the idea of subcreation, incidentally, is why he hated the Chronicles of Narnia so much.
Exactly.
Because he
Exactly.
thought, as a subcreator, the worlds that we create have to have complete integrity, which was another reason he was so slow at writing. But he hated Lewis's writing because he didn't think it had any artistic integrity. It just kind of threw all the different myths that Lewis liked together, and
So to Tolkien, it almost seems blasphemous because it's something that's so holy that you're doing when you're creating these worlds.
Exactly. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so do you want to tell us some random facts about Tolkien? Because he's a character. I'd love to hear some random facts.
He's a strange bird. He had a very strange sense of humor. He loved playing pranks, and he loved playing pranks with Lewis. And he convinced Lewis one time to dress up as polar bears and go to a non-costume party dressed like that.
Why not? Why not?
Why not?
As polar bears.
Polar bears. They walked around the whole night dressed as polar bears, and people were probably like, "What are you doing?"
Yeah. Oh, I love that. So cool.
I used to watch this British show. Tolkien's sense of humor kind of reminds me of this show I used to watch called Trigger Happy TV. I don't know if you ever heard of that or saw that.
No.
But they would do things kind of like that. Like at one point, the guy called a rodent exterminator and took him up to his attic, and there's a guy sitting on his couch, like dressed in a mouse costume, like reading a newspaper. I don't know if you can do anything about this, I've tried everything.
Yeah. That's awesome.
Yeah. At another point, they're like in an internet cafe, and like he's got this huge oversized cell phone, and it rings, and he picks it up. He's like, "Hello, internet cafe." What? An internet cafe.
I just love, I love the commitment. That's what I love about Tolkien and Lewis. Like, it's not even a costume party. Who cares? Yeah. Like, let's go out and get some polar bear suits.
Right. This probably took like 2 or 3 hours. Like, it's a party the whole night.
Such
the whole night
commitment.
In character, committed.
I love it. I love it. Anything else you want to tell us about Tolkien?
Yeah, at another point, he got tired of fans showing up at his house. Like Lord of the Rings kind of became famous by the 60s. It was really big. And he would dress up as an Anglo-Saxon warrior with a real battle axe and chase visitors away.
Yeah. Chase them down the street, right?
Chase them down the street. He was also known to go into shops, and when the store clerk would ask for payment, he would hand them his false teeth instead of the money, and he'd smile at them, gum smile.
I can't handle that one. That one's disgusting.
Oh, would that gross you out?
Oh, totally. If someone hands me their false teeth, I might cut off my hands. Just feral. So feral.
I have to keep that in mind.
Yeah. Never hand me your false teeth.
If I ever meet you, I probably will.
Yeah, exactly. I'll just keep it to Zooms from now on.
Yeah.
No, very cool. Anything else you want to say about Tolkien?
That's really all I got about him. I actually knew probably the least about him of any of the four.
That's okay. It's a brilliant overview. We have had these 4 heroes of Christian history explained to us very, very well by Mr. John Adams. Thank you so much, John. You are just brilliant.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Anytime.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us on the first ever episode of the Eagle and Child podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it. Obviously, we started with a most brilliant guest in John Adams, but we have an incredible lineup for the rest of season 1. Season 1 is already stacked. We've got into season 2, season 3. So if this podcast absolutely tanks, we're going to be flogging this dead horse for a good while yet. So I think we've got Chris Palmer coming up. We've got Gabriel Finocchio. We've got Josh Bidell. We've got Felicia Masonheimer. A whole bunch coming up over the next couple of months. So we would love for you to stick with us. Check out the Eagle and Child podcast, and we will see you guys soon. Thank you so much, John, for joining us, and we'll see you guys later. Bye-bye. Thanks so much for tuning into the Eagle and Child podcast. That's all from us for today. If you want to support us, you can like, subscribe, or drop us a review. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at Eagle and Child Podcast. We'll catch you next time. Much love.